Welcome into the Art of Save Scumming. This title has been reinvigorated in a post-Thrones of Decay world. The player data suggests that we are getting a whole lot of new players in, so I thought I would take a little bit of time out and do a video on my suggested campaigns, whether you're coming into the game after a long hiatus or if you're just picking it up for the first time. What campaigns should you look at potentially starting with? Maybe your first, we'll call it the first 5 campaigns. These are not necessarily the most basic campaigns. Just because something is complicated doesn't mean that it's not a good noob campaign. It's just what teaches you aspects of the game the best. So go into new campaign, Immortal Empires, and here's our screen. There are 3 suggested races by Creative Assembly. I'm going to say probably not, but I would say that one of the ones that they marked, the High Elves, is the starting race that you ought to play for your very first campaign. You just picked up the game, you never played it before. High Elves is where you're going, and you're going for Tyrion. And the reason why we're going for Tyrion is because he is, in my opinion, the most basic campaign. He's got a very forgiving campaign. He's got a very strong military. His campaign mechanics look like Tyrion hits things very hard. You add things to his army to add extra capabilities. Now, you could potentially pick one of these others, but they have a little extra flavor added to them on top of it. A little extra magic. Alariel's campaign is actually a little bit more punishing because her campaign mechanics are built around boosts when you've got Althwan consolidated and negatives, debuffs, when she doesn't have it consolidated. Elithanar, he's a little bit more punishing in that his stuff is kind of timed. So there's a certain timeline that you have to meet for his stuff, and if you don't meet that, then you don't get all the buffs. Imric is probably, as far as all of these concerned, as far as bolt-on mechanics are concerned, he's probably got the easiest. He's a dragon hunter, goes and collects dragons, gets a whole bunch of buffs for dragons. But I would say probably the most fun of all of them, in my opinion, is Altharion. And he has got a whole mechanic dealing with Athel Tamara. So if you find yourself playing Tyrion and then you want something that's a little bit more long game situated, there's a lot to do in his campaign, so that one might be a good choice. Now, in addition to simplicity, what makes the High Elves a good starting race is that they have a very strong military. They've got everything that you could possibly touch in the game is in the High Elf race. You got magic, you got archers, you got cav, you've got chariots, you've got big monsters, you got flying monsters. There's everything that you could possibly need to ever touch in the campaign. High Elves have it, so you'll be exposed to the most amount of things, and they don't have extremely powerful frontline infantry, for instance. So it requires you to actually tactically do something, and that's the problem that I have for new players playing like the Dwarves, for instance. While the Dwarves are a really good campaign if you need your hand held, because the Dwarves have such heavily armored units that you really, it's hard to lose with the Dwarves. So if you tend more towards the I don't ever want to lose type thing, then maybe playing the Dwarves, because they have a really strong front line and it's really easy to rely on their units to hold for long periods of time. The High Elves are a little bit more squishy than the Dwarves, but they have a lot more utility, because you're not going to see cav, for instance, with the Dwarves. If you go from here to any cav-based faction like Slaanesh or something like that, you're going to be like, I have no idea how to do this, because you'd never got exposed to it playing as the Dwarves. Now, as far as the next faction, I'm actually going to do a complete 180 on you and say that you should go with the Skaven. And the reason you should go with the Skaven is because this bolts on a second mechanic that is integral to your campaign, a second resource, if you will. And the second resource of the Skaven is food. You use the food to do various things in the campaign, mostly to bump up your settlements so you can rapidly expand. The reason I choose the Skaven is not only because I am a Skaven specialist, but because the Skaven's food mechanic is super simple. So you have management of a second resource integrated into the campaign, and now you're managing two different things. But it's not a super complicated algorithm to figure out how to manage those things. Now, as far as the Skaven Legendary Lord that I think that you ought to pick, the most curb stompy of all of them is Claw, because he has nuclear weapons, okay? Now, the difference here is that he is very, very situated and very, very focused around weapons teams. So there are many factions that you're going to play that have a very weapons-centered campaign, as in defensive positions built around small key units, and then the rest of the army is built around keeping everything away from those units. Claw is pretty much the embodiment of that. So if you play any faction that is very reliant on its back line, then this would be a very good campaign to get into for learning the value of defending those key units and really focusing down on those. Because, like, for instance, he starts out with these ratling guns. They're rats with unlimited ammo machine guns, which are freaking badass. However, if one melee infantry unit gets into your back line, this whole army is toast. You can be rolling around with a 5,000 gold army and just absolutely slaying. But if you go up against something that can get into your back line, you are absolutely toast. Now, if you want to go for something that's a little bit more Skaven hit and run themed, then the other one that I would suggest is probably Snitch here. The thing about him is his campaign mechanics, there's a lot going on with his campaign mechanics. So probably not for the first campaign. Same thing with Throt. Maybe not for your first Skaven campaign, because there's a lot of things that plug into his workshop mechanic. And then the other three lords are the vanilla lords, and this one is mostly melee infantry, another spin on mostly melee infantry, and plagues. And the plagues don't really jive with what Nurgle's got going on, so I don't really have as much fun playing Skrulk right now, because I know that there is something else for him on the horizon. So now you got two campaigns on your belt. You went and you played Tyrion, and then you went and you played Claw. Where do you go now? Now I think you go to the Empire. And the place that I suggest that you go for the Empire is the new Legendary Lord, Elspeth von Draken. The reason I think you go here is this is very close to what you just played as far as Ikit's mechanics are concerned, but now you took the nuclear weapons out of it. And you still have a very heavy emphasis on that back line, those war machines, the gun units, as well as the artillery, all very centered in her campaign. But you don't have the nukes, and you actually have units that can hold a true front line, because in the Skaven, you've got units that, unless you're paying for expensive Storm Vermin units, you don't really have the leadership to have a full front line that actually holds. So having a diverse back line with a good front line and a lot of buffs that feel rewarding as you go through the campaign, highly suggest that you go with Elspeth for your third campaign. Now, there is some cool stuff in here if you wanted to do a little bit, maybe you didn't want to go as hard into the gun units. I think that Marcus's campaign is definitely off the table. I don't think that you do this until probably your 10th campaign, because this one's pretty punishing. Gelt, you could go him if you want to do a lot of magic work. So if you were thinking about going to maybe Tzeentch for a campaign soon, then maybe you go Balthazar Gelt for your third campaign. Volkmar, he has more of a quest campaign, so if you were going to do something that is a little bit more questy, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, like if you're going to go Tomb Kings or something like that, or if you were going to do Vampire Coast, then maybe you would choose Volkmar as your third campaign for the purposes of kind of keeping similar style of gameplay, but a little bit different faction mechanic. Karl Franz is still, in my opinion, a little bit of a difficult campaign for a starting player. He works very strongly in the electric counts campaign mechanic, and I just think that that's still a little bit too complicated for your third campaign to play it and play it well. So you got 3 campaigns under your belt. You played the High Elves, then you played the Skaven, then you played the Empire. Where do you go now? We're going to shift gears completely, go to a demon faction. I think that you play as Tzeentch, as Kairos Fateweaver. And the reason that this should be your 4th campaign is this, unlike any other campaign, is built around magic management. And this is a fantastic campaign for that. It still has a very simple economy, but he gets straight up cheats that allow you to do weird stuff on the campaign map, which can be very fun, but it teaches you magic management. All of the demon factions, except for Khorne, have some integration with magic. Kairos takes it to the next level, and he has a very simple economy, but there are plenty of things to manipulate in his campaign mechanics. The downside to this campaign is you start off with pretty difficult enemies. And while you have all the things that you need to deal with those enemies, I would not put this as the first campaign that you should play, because right off the bat, you're going to have to fight against a DLC Lizardmen faction, and then you're going to spend the first 50 or so turns fighting against Lizardmen and High Elves, which are decent counters to what you have to bring to the table. So for those reasons, I would say, hey, this should not be the first campaign that you should play, but it is ratcheting ourselves up a little bit more challenging as far as the enemies that you're going to go up against. Closing in on the last one, you've had 4 campaigns under your belt. You played the High Elves, then you played the Skaven, then you played the Empire, then you went and played Tzeentch under Kairos. Where do you go now? What's your 5th campaign that is going to really bring you into learning how to play Total War Warhammer 3? And that is the Chaos Dwarves. This one is awesome. And the reason that this is awesome is there is so much to do in these campaigns. Doesn't matter which legendary lord you pick. In my opinion, if you want a cushy campaign and you follow the presented paths, then Zatan is probably the cushiest start. Both of these are going to be relatively more intensive depending on how aggressive you are. I would say that this is probably the 2nd easiest, and then Drazoath the Ashen has a relatively intensive campaign. So probably not Drazoath, but either Zatan or Astrogoth for your Chaos Dwarves. Now, why the Chaos Dwarves? The Chaos Dwarves do not have supply lines that you've had to deal with in every single faction up to this point. They deal on resource management. They have multiple resources that you balance for the purposes of advancing your campaign. And all those things that plug into those campaign mechanics make you a resource managing master. If you can play a strong Chaos Dwarf campaign and get the resource management, there is nothing else in this game that is going to bother you as far as figuring out what's going wrong in your campaign. Because typically in any campaign, you've got really a few things to manage. You've got growth, control, and money, and maybe a secondary resource. Chaos Dwarves have all of that and additional resources on top of that you acquire from different means throughout your campaign. Plus, they're a chaos-related faction, so you have to manage corruption to your ends. They also have a true bifurcated build chain, unlike you've seen up to this point. The demons sort of hint at that, but you can have complete differentiation of your settlement types as the Chaos Dwarfs, which adds a complete different dimension to how you build your provinces relative to other factions. Anyway, that's my take on the first 5 campaigns that a new player should look at when it comes to Total War Warhammer 3. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you on another one here at the Art of Safe Scumming.